Good morning, everyone. This morning, I'm here to tell you a little bit about one of our important Unitarian ancestors, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph was born in the Boston area in 1803, so more than 200 years ago. And he, for our religion, Unitarian Universalism, he is a very important minister, writer, philosopher, naturalist, just someone who really helped open our eyes to the divine spirit in all of creation. Ralph did not go to school until he was 9 years old, which wasn't that uncommon in the early 1800s. But he made up for lost time, and by the age of 14, he had enrolled at Harvard College. He came from a long line of Unitarian ministers, and each one of them had a very similar schooling. Ralph was able to become a very well-known minister at Second Boston by the time he was under 30 years old. And one of the things that he really wanted the Unitarians of the day to know was that they were given reason by God, but they were also given a very individual sense of spirituality. And I actually have some Play-Doh here to demonstrate one of his most important ideas. Now, Play-Doh obviously had not been developed in Emerson's time, but we're still going to use it. So if you have Play-Doh at home, you can go and get it and just pick a color. I've chosen purple, and just kind of make a ball out of this Play-Doh. And this Play-Doh represents all living things: humans, animals, plants, water. And I want you to pinch off a small piece of the Play-Doh and make a little ball. I have to say, I still love the smell of Play-Doh. Even as a mature adult, I love the smell of Play-Doh. This little piece of Play-Doh from this giant ball of living beings, this represents you. And I'm going to ask you to take your thumb and squish that ball of Play-Doh so that your own unique thumbprint is in that ball of Play-Doh. And I'm going to set mine down for a minute. Now, in the 1800s, so imagine the time that Ralph Waldo Emerson was preaching and writing and thinking. It was only 50 to 60 years after the American Revolution in 1776, and that war that separated the United States from England. And so we can think about the American people really in their teenage years as compared to where we are now in 2021. And just like teenagers in all cultures need to begin the process of kind of moving away from their parents and having their own ideas, the American people were really searching for their own unique culture and ideas that would make them different from Great Britain, from their British parents. And Ralph Waldo Emerson and some of his friends started a group called the Transcendentalists. Now, the Transcendentalists only were together about 4 years in their writings and their sharing of their ideas, but they were very, very influential. And one of the interesting things about them is that they were really, really into Eastern religion. And Buddhist and Hindu scripture and texts and books had just begun to be translated into English in the early 1800s. And so the Transcendentalists were reading these and getting a lot of new ideas about philosophy and about religion. And one of those ideas was about kind of the oneness of God and this idea that there is a divine spark of divinity in all of us. And so I have another ball of Play-Doh, bright yellow Play-Doh, And this is going to represent God, divinity. Now, in the time of Ralph Waldo Emerson, God was separate from man and world. God was often imagined to be this old father figure, but definitely separate from the earth. And Ralph Waldo Emerson thought of God as something that was bigger, more expansive than that. He thought, and I'm going to take a little piece of this yellow Play-Doh. He thought that everything in the world was so interconnected by divinity, however you might imagine God. And he thought that this divine spark was inside every living thing. If you have Play-Doh at home, go ahead and put your little color spark of divinity inside of yourself. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, again, thought that inside all of nature and humans was a spark of divinity. And he called this God as the web of nature. God as the web of nature. And that was a very new idea. And that's one of the ideas that Unitarian Universalists have really come to claim as their own. This idea of the interconnectivity of all living things and the idea of a little piece of divinity inside of everything. And this relates to our seventh principle, the interconnected web of all being. Today, March 20th, is just the beginning of the first day of spring, the spring equinox. And I challenge each one of you watching to go outside and just breathe in nature, breathe in the divine spirit in all living and growing things. Bye for now. Please join me for the reading today. This is a reading written by Ralph Waldo Emerson entitled The Oversoul. This is a responsive reading, and I will begin. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds.
As there is no ceiling or screen between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease, and God, the cause, begins.
I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine.
There is deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is accessible to us.
Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it, it is memorable.
It comes to the lowly and the simple. It comes to whosoever will put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity and grandeur.
The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception.
Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable.
Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one.
When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affection, it is love.
Good morning, everyone at East Shore. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I want you to know that I look forward to my annual visits to this congregation. Even if this is a virtual visit, I'm very happy to be with you this morning. And I think almost everyone knows that I am a hospital chaplain. I work at the VA in Cleveland, and I often will share a story from my work at the hospital as part of my sermon. And this morning is no different. This morning I want to tell you about a veteran that I recently began working with. And this is a man who was a biologist, and when he returned home from Iraq, he was able to return to work. He was collecting and analyzing water samples in some of the water sources in the Pacific Northwest. And he was able to do this work for a while because he was pretty much working by himself. Then he began to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and it was time for him to come in to our hospital and begin some specialized treatment. And in my very first spiritual care session with this veteran, he began talking to me about the importance of his faith and his spirituality and how it was very closely tied up with his experience of nature. And he asked me if I had ever heard of the Transcendentalists. And I said, yes, I have heard of the Transcendentalists. And he said, have you ever heard of a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson? And I was able to see why, yes, I have heard of a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he began to tell me about how, beginning in high school, he started reading some of Emerson's works and how this had been foundational in his understanding of the interconnectedness of nature. And he was really hoping to be able to get back to some of that spirituality as a source of strength for him as he was battling with his PTSD and his addiction. Now, I can really count on one hand the number of people in my 6 years at the VA who have wanted to speak to me about transcendentalism and Ralph Waldo Emerson in particular. And I took this as a time that maybe this would be a good opportunity for me to share with you some of the legacy of Ralph Waldo Emerson that I think is very important for our faith. And one of the things that I think that it's important to understand is that Ralph Waldo Emerson was a man who lived with great grief and loss throughout his life. He came from a long line of ministers, 7 generations, and his father was the Unitarian minister of First Boston in the early 1800s. Now, Ralph was only 8 years old when his father died, and it was a large family. He had 2 sisters and 5 other brothers, and they were left without any income when his father died. And so Emerson's mother took in boarders into their home to begin to make ends meet. And there's a story that Ralph and his brother Charles were very close in age and size. They had one winter coat that they shared between them as they went to school. One would wear the coat one day, the other would wear the coat the next day. During this period of his childhood, both of his sisters and one of his brothers died. Emerson's mother remained very committed to the education of her remaining sons, and Emerson entered Harvard College at the age of 14, graduating at the age of 18. And it was at this very young age that Emerson began to keep a journal, a practice that he would keep until the very end of his days. The notes and phrases that he wrote down in his diary became the basis for his essays and his poetry. And even at this young age, he was able to record ecstatic religious experiences with a divine source that he called the Oversoul. After graduating Harvard, he taught for a few years, and then he entered the Harvard Divinity School. And this was, of course, in keeping with his family tradition. At the age of 26, he was called to be an associate minister to Second Unitarian Church in Boston. He met a young woman named Ellen Tucker, and he married her when she was 18, and it was a magnificent love affair. Even as a young man, Emerson was quite extraordinary. By the age of 30, he was already married. He was the minister of Second Boston, a prominent church. He was the chaplain of the Massachusetts state legislature, and he sat on the Boston School Committee. He was well respected and influential and earned a good income. However, less than 2 years after their marriage, his dear Ellen died of tuberculosis. So another major death. And he was grief-stricken, but he was comforted with this idea that her soul was in heaven and that she would be a source of inspiration and a guiding spirit for him. Soon after her death, really engulfed in this deep depression, he stepped down from the pulpit of Second Boston, and he goes to Europe for some restoration and for a change of scenery. So we see this man who really is just beginning to be at the very height of his success, both personally and professionally, and grief and loss again changing the trajectory of his life. So by the age of 30, he's lived through the death of his father, 2 of his sisters, 1 brother, and his beloved wife. So I think as we look at his understanding of spirituality, it's important to ask ourselves, how have grief and loss contributed to his work and his philosophy? It sent him on a very, very powerful inward journey as he began to process who he was, who God is for him, and how God is at work in the world. And in 1836, when he's 33, he publishes a powerful essay entitled Nature. And this is the essay that my veteran had read in high school. And some scholars see nature as the manifesto for the transcendentalists. And in this volume, Emerson is sharing his idea about the role of nature and how nature reveals God, the divine, to human beings. For Emerson, nature is the web of God. The web of God. Emerson believed our experience of God should be personal and in the present. He did not believe people should depend on what others told them about God. Emerson preached that we each had the ability to experience the divine for ourselves through our own unique lens. And 1836 was the same year that the Transcendentalists formed. And it was centered in Boston and Concord, Massachusetts. And along with Emerson, the Unitarians Henry David Thoreau, Theodore Parker, and Margaret Fuller were leaders of the group. Transcendentalism has been called America's first homegrown intellectual movement. Embedded in this movement were the core romantic concepts of emotion and intuition, along with the focus on personal spiritual experience and one's individual conscience, which we now live into these ideas in our Principle 3 and 5. Principle 3 being the acceptance of one another and encouragement of spiritual growth in our congregations, and Principle 5 being the right of conscience and the use of the democratic processes in our congregation and in society. The Transcendentalists saw Unitarianism of the day as cold and dry and unemotional, and they really were advocating for a personal connection to the divine. Specifically, Emerson looked at the God within as a basis for this faith. This is the divine spark within each of us. This is that piece of yellow Play-Doh. Emerson did not personify God. He did not make God into a human figure-like being. He had a much larger, expansive idea of who the divine could be and how it could function in our world. And this more ambiguous and really personal understanding of the divine was quite difficult for the establishment, the Unitarian establishment of that time, to digest. And even today, in my work at the hospital, I find there are many people who are Christian who find it hard to understand this idea or believe that each human being has a divine spark within them. In 1838, Emerson was asked to address the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School. And at this point, Unitarians were really focused on reason and biblical scholarship to understand Scripture. Emerson basically told the ministers to stop conforming to this current status quo of using reason, and that their real job was to lead their congregations and their parishioners to look within themselves, to connect to that divine spark for guidance in leading an ethical life. He went on to point out many defects in his understanding of historical Christianity, and he rejected a personal historical God. He found no basis for the Trinity. In fact, many years earlier, he had stopped offering communion to his congregation at Second Boston based on his reading of Scripture. So Emerson was basically banned from Harvard after giving this address that we now know as the Divinity School address. But he was really seen as a hero by some of the younger ministers who were in that audience, ministers such as Theodore Parker, who went on to focus his life and his ministry on social justice issues, such as abolition and women's suffrage. For UU seminarians, the Divinity School Address is the only required reading by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I think this is because in this sermon, Emerson is instilling in new young ministers the idea that the role of the minister really is, really is to break through the status quo and try to instill dangerous ideas in ourselves and in our congregation. Our role as a minister is to be not only minister, but teacher, and to teach the idea that it is our responsibility and our right to think for ourselves. And Emerson wanted Unitarian ministers to preach this message to their congregations. Emerson asked each one of us to discern who we will be in the world. Emerson continuously rallies us to believe that we have the resources within ourselves to truly understand the world. And even though Emerson was banned from Harvard Divinity School, he continued on as a lecturer, and he was really a rock star in this circuit of public speaking. He would have been the person who got the most hits for a TED Talk on YouTube. So think Brene Brown, her TED Talk on shame and vulnerability. That would have been Emerson in the 1830s and 40s. He was that famous. Many 19th century conservatives saw Emerson on a slippery slope to atheism. They reasoned that if you only look inside yourself, you are simply worshiping yourself. And this is not true. This is not what Emerson was preaching. He was preaching the idea that right action trumped a dry creedal belief, and that this idea of right action combined with the understanding that we are all one in the universe. We are all interconnected. This web of God is what Emerson was inspired by and trying to instill in the people that came to listen to him speak. Transcendentalists saw not only perfecting themselves, but they also saw perfecting society, reforming society as pursuits that could not be uncoupled from each other. Some, like Emerson, were very focused on personal spiritual pursuits, and others, like Theodore Parker, were very focused on outward social justice and reform. In fact, Emerson and the Transcendentalists were greatly influenced by the Hindu faith. The Hindu devotion to nature and the inherent grace in all living creatures and beings struck a chord, a very deep chord, with the Transcendentalists. And it's interesting to me that the main idea in the Bhagavad Gita is to claim one's destiny. We know that Emerson read and was influenced by Hindu religion and philosophy, and the Hindu quest to cultivate a personal relationship with the divine. And that was really an inspirational idea for the Transcendentalists. So I think that the legacy of Ralph Waldo Emerson is quite influential on our current day Unitarian Universalism. Some of this legacy is very obvious, such as the belief that Jesus is not divine and the understanding that we are all interconnected with each other and with the larger natural world. Some of his legacy may not be as obvious. Unitarian Universalists support each other in our search for truth and meaning. And this is our fourth principle. Emerson expressed this idea in many ways. We are interconnected through our shared ability to decide what provides most meaning to us. And we are bound together in this universal, natural order, which for Emerson was also a moral order, this web of God. We each carve a path through our own unique experiences that allow us to connect to and be a part of this web. A common criticism of Unitarian Universalism is that one can believe in anything and still be a UU. Again, this is not true. In order to fully participate in our denomination, one must be willing to covenant to support not only our search for truth and meaning, but everyone in the congregation and in the larger community's search for truth and meaning. We are the church in this search. And in order to agree to this, we understand that there is indeed a truth that we must search for. Emerson led us on this first step of the path that our denomination has followed, this idea that each individual must be the ultimate source of his or her own religious authority. Probably Emerson's most well-known essay is Self-Reliance. And this is one that many of us, I know I had to read it in high school, maybe you read it in high school as well. For Emerson, the term self-reliance, again, it's not synonymous with autonomy or isolation. Emerson saw self-reliance as this first step towards self-actualization, with the understanding that we then move with our moral compass out into that larger universe, that larger web of God. This leads to, for many people, social activism. And Emerson himself was a highly communal man. He remarried in his 30s and had 4 children. His home was always open and filled with visitors. Grief was a constant in his life. When his firstborn son was 5, he succumbed to fever. 2 of his brothers died in young adulthood. Yet Emerson remained able to process his grief through his writing, his long walks in nature, through his poetry, and he shared this grief in his writing. He offered his grief to the world because he understood again that it was something that connected us to each other and that suffering is unavoidable. So as we continue to live in this time of COVID, I know that grief is also present to each one of us every day. We have all lost something in this year of the pandemic. This weekend, however, is the spring equinox, and we begin to turn our attention to the outside world, to the miracle of the rebirth of nature, to longer days, to healing. May we find comfort and hope in this new greening that we witness when we go outside and look outside of our windows. In our modern time, we are so often pulled away from that which may be most sustaining: poetry, moments of silence, long walks outside, listening to the sounds of the rustling leaves and the birds. May you take some time over the next few days, maybe even today, to spend some time in nature and to be a part of what Emerson calls the web of God, the web of God. This is a precious legacy. Embrace it. May it be so.
Okay, I'm Ben Kotowski.
And I'm Julia Kotowski.
Hi, my name is Dee.
And we started coming to East Shore because, in a roundabout way, our son was complaining to his grandparents that it was so conservative in Geauga County that people were very intolerant. And they said, well, maybe you'd like to go to East Shore with us because there are kids there who are going to be more like you, who you'll be able to really have an affinity with. And he went and he kept going, and he told his sister that she should go, and she started going, and she enjoyed RE. And then they told us we should go, and we went, and a couple of years later we joined.
Yeah, that was in 2012 that we started going, and then the next year we decided to join, and it's been a really great experience for both of us.
One autumn day, I was driving in my car. I was actually headed out to the apple farm. And I'm driving on 306, and to the right, I see a sign that says East Shore Unitarian Church. All the time, I thought the church was still in Mentor. Once I saw where the church was, I immediately thought, I'm going to go to the church on the next Sunday service. And that's what I did. And I've been coming back ever since.
Yeah, can you share a good memory?
Yeah, I'd say the coming of age program, which I was a mentor for, and I got to know my mentee Becca Ray and some of the other kids, and we really delved into and they got to write their own faith statements.
Seeing them as they grapple with these questions. Usually these are done with, not a lot of preparation, like sort of the night before kind of thing, but all of a sudden they crystallize things that they've been thinking about for years. And you come up with sometimes some very sophisticated faith statements, and other times you see a young person really, maybe for the first time in their life, really putting together these thoughts and sharing them with people, which takes a bit of courage. You don't want to be, you don't want to stumble. You don't want to be mocked for what you believe. And it's a very supportive atmosphere. And it's really inspirational to me to hear them.
It's actually hard to share just one great memory because there have been many fun times in the kitchen with friends preparing the community meals, beach cleanups with lunch and good conversation afterwards, delicious auction dinners that I bid on, and last but not least, Rev Denis and Rev Joe's wedding, which was really very cool.
And we've really enjoyed our time working with other members of the congregation in these activities.
And giving to East Shore means you're taking a piece of ownership because it belongs to us, the congregational. We're a congregationally based denomination. And that means that we support it. It's ours. What happens within that building, what happens within our spiritual life, what happens within our community is ours. It doesn't belong to anyone else. And that means it's ours to support. It's ours to nurture. We are the stewards of it.
Giving in relationships that I have has given me great joy. I always feel it comes back to you in one form or another. Sometimes just checking in with people is all they need on that day, and it makes me happy to know I may have lifted someone's spirits.
Hi, I am Mary Mason. I am the chair of the Stewardship Committee for East Shore Unitarian Universalist Church in Kirtland, Ohio. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "We are rich through what we give and poor only through what we refuse." Stewardship to me means that I support the institutions, causes, and ideals which are important to me. I do this by giving what I am able financially and volunteering to give my time, my effort, and my abilities. It is in my character to want to do my share. Whatever my financial resources allow, however my available time allows me to contribute, I want to support the communities of which I am a part. East Shore UU Church creates a space where we can exchange dangerous ideas about how to be in the world and how to make justice, and that takes support. I am very grateful to be a member of East Shore UU Church because of our congregation's willingness to exchange these dangerous ideas about how to be in the world and how to make justice, and backing those ideas up with support. I have learned a lot. Just a few examples. My 7th principal small group, where we studied the intersection of environmental issues and racism. Queer Eye on the Bible. Currently, Project 1619, which is studying and discussing the long-lasting effects of slavery on our nation. These and other programs are made possible by contributions of money, time, and expertise. For this, I am grateful. And to me, gratitude should be an action word, which is why I'm here as chair of your Stewardship Committee, reminding you of our pledge campaign. In researching the UUA resources online for stewardship, I came across the Fair Share Contribution Guide. It is an excellent tool for me to use in determining what I should contribute based on what my income is. I have to say, I am not surprised to find such a useful resource, one that is careful to acknowledge we all have differing abilities to financially pledge to our church, and lays out the varying levels you should consider. Since I am a relative newcomer to Unitarian Universalism, I plan on using this resource each year to determine that I am supporting our congregation at the level I wish to do. Do I wish to be a supporter, a sustainer, a visionary, or a transformer? Questions that each of us must ask ourselves. In my opinion, our answers in response to the pledge drive then enable us at our annual meeting to make the same decisions at a congregational level. Is East Shore to be supportive, sustained, visionary, or transforming as a congregational community? Which is why it remains important to return your pledge cards, make your decisions about what your contribution will be this year in as timely a fashion as you are able. This allows our financial committee and the Board of Trustees to know what our income will be and make recommendations that we will vote on at our annual meeting. I would like to thank Lynn Kilgore, Dave Michael, Shirley and Steve Hairston, Morgan and David Mason, Dan Adamson, Reggie Komar, Dorothy Lemmy, Ken Schmidt, Jerry Green, and Dee Beecham for their prompt return of their pledges for fiscal year 2021 through 2022. If you have returned your pledge and have not been acknowledged, please know that we are contacting everyone to make sure we have your permission to use your name. If anyone is still awaiting the arrival of their pledge packet, please let me know and I will arrange to get one delivered to you. Thank you for your time.
And now, as we end our time together, may you hear these words as we extinguish the chalice. And now may we go forth in the certainty of faith and in the knowledge of love and in the vision of hope. And in our going, may we be blessed with all good things today, tomorrow, and forever. May you be well. May it be so. Amen.
Ready, set, go! We join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship,
pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom,
which transcends all creeds.
Not to think alike, but to journey together.